For this lecture, we are talking about the Gilded Age. And the first thing that I want to point out is the time period that we're talking about. So we are starting with 1870 and going into the 1890s. So essentially, we're talking about 20 to 30 years of American history. And you'll notice that there is overlap with the Reconstruction era, because Reconstruction doesn't end until 1877 with the Compromise of 1877. The Gilded Age really begins in 1870. And so I want to talk about what we mean by the Gilded Age, how we get there, and what the implications are. For the next two lectures, for this lecture and the next, this is the time period we're focusing on. We are focusing on the 1870s and the 1890s. So essentially, Unit 1 is covering 1865 right up until 1900, essentially. And in talking about the Gilded Age and what that means and what's happening in the country, we have to start by talking about the guy who calls it the Gilded Age, and that's Mark Twain. Mark Twain is the most popular and the most famous writer and satirist writer, especially in the country, and perhaps one of the most famous writers in American history. Mark Twain writes a book that he calls The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. And he's writing specifically about the 1870s and the 1880s, and he's looking at the time of tremendous success, tremendous wealth, tremendous advances in technology, and he's essentially talking about how on the outside there's a lot of wealth, and to somebody looking on the outside, what they would see is success, and they would see prosperity. They would see a country that's doing incredibly well. But Twain then says, if they were to look a little harder, if they paid more attention, what they would notice is that there's actually a lot of corruption and poverty and greed, and it's very ugly on the inside. Gilded is a reference to a very thin layer of gold leaf. And if you know someone who does a lot of arts and crafts and they've worked with gold leaf before, gold leaf is very delicate, and you have to be gentle with it because it's easily ripped apart. And gold leaf is typically used to cover furniture or cover, frames and that sort of thing to make them look prettier. But if you were to take the gold leaf off, it would reveal what the actual furniture or the actual frame looks like, right? And it's usually something that is stained or peeling or falling apart. And that's what Twain is talking about. He says, listen, on the outside, the United States looks really successful. It looks like there's prosperity. Immigrants are coming in because there are so many jobs available. There are technological advances when it comes to the railroads, when it comes to production and industry. There are people moving out west and settling the West. And there is this extraordinary movement of people into the cities, and everything looks great from the outside. But if you were to move into the United States, and if you were to spend some time in the cities, it is not a great reality. For example, the picture that you see on the bottom left is a picture of the unification of the Transcontinental Railroad, which takes place in 1868. This unification happens in Utah. The Transcontinental Railroad technically is not transcontinental, but mumble, mumble, we're not going to get into that right now. The Transcontinental Railroad is a huge moment in American history because essentially this railroad literally connects East Coast to West Coast. And it's seen as a symbolic unification of the country after all of this time of being so spread apart. We now have a railroad that connects us all together, and railroads are seen as this huge sign of American prosperity and American success, how quickly Americans can travel from one place to another. But what you don't see is that the railroad that's built from California going out to Utah is built by Chinese laborers who were paid literally $1 a day, worked 6 days a week, and were not given proper housing or food. They had to live by the sides of the railroad tracks that they built. They worked with dynamite so that they can blow tunnels into mountain ranges, and many of them were either killed or severely hurt, and nothing was done to compensate their families. That's not the story that you see in that picture. That picture is a celebratory picture, right? And that's what Twain is talking about. Another phrase that comes to light during this time period of the Gilded Age is conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is a reference to how people are flaunting their wealth. I want to just make sure that we understand the definitions of words here. So conspicuous is essentially another word for obvious, or standing out. And consumption is a reference to stuff, the things that people are buying, the things that people own and have. So essentially showing off what you have, showing off what you own. And that is in reference to the picture that I've posted on the right-hand side. The bottom right, you can see people in these ornate costumes that are dressed in these insane powdered wigs and these huge dresses. Basically, these are photographs of a ball that took place in New York. And in reference to this ball, it was officially known as the Bradley Martin Ball. The Bradley Martin Ball takes place in February of 1897. And it's hosted by, a woman named Cornelia Bradley Martin. And it was in the Guinness Book of Records for nearly a century as the most expensive and most lavish party ever thrown. The Bradley Martin family spent approximately $9.7 million. That's in present day money. $9.7 million in 21st century value, of course, to actually host this party, this gala. Now, back then in 1897, it was still hundreds of thousands of dollars. Okay, so here's why this is even more significant. Okay, so there are 800 people at this party. And they spent $400,000 to create this sort of image of people who are walking in as kings and queens, and that's why they're dressed in this way. And this is how they justified it. The Bradley Martins claimed that the ball was to create, and I quote, an economic stimulus that would benefit the lower classes. So in other words, they're throwing the party worth $400,000 in 1897 money. They're throwing the party to help poor people. I just want you to sit and meditate on that for a second. So here's this party that is the most expensive, most lavish party. It's so expensive that it's in the Guinness Book of World Records. And it is thrown essentially at the tail end of an economic depression. Mind you, the depression had started in 1893, and it goes on for a while, and as a sign almost to celebrate the end of this economic depression, which, by the way, these people never really felt the ramifications of, at least not to any real extreme extent, they throw this kind of ball. And it is at this is sort of an indication of conspicuous consumption, right? This opportunity to show off everything that you have, all the wealth that you have access to, whether it's through your clothes, through your jewelry, through your homes. This is the sort of status and this is the sort of lifestyle that they are establishing, but also that people are starting to aspire to. The problem, though, is there it is. The problem, though, is that it's essentially unattainable, and we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. I want to talk about how we get there first. Credit to the Gilded Age is a result of the Second Industrial Revolution. So the First Industrial Revolution takes place just before the Civil War, and it takes place in a concentrated area for the United States. It's right around New England. And I want to emphasize this also. The industrial revolutions are global. They're not just in the United States. They are happening around the world. So the first industrial revolution happens everywhere, but for the United States, it's happening primarily in New England. The second industrial revolution, however, takes place from 1870s to 1920. So we're talking about the course of 50 years. We are talking about a complete change in how people work, what people do for work, and the impact of that work on their regular lives. When we talk about industrial or the word industry, we are talking about mechanized work, right? Things that industries or factories produce. That's what I want you to keep in mind. So we're talking about industry, and then I want you to pay attention to that word revolution. Revolution is an upheaval, right? It's something that causes a complete and total change, turning something upside down. And in this particular case, over the course of 50 years, what happens is the Second Industrial Revolution by 1880, so within a decade, a vast majority of the American workforce was now engaged in non-farming jobs for the first time in American history. And that's a huge, huge development. A majority of the American workforce was engaged in non-farming jobs. By 1890, 2/3 of Americans worked for wages rather than for themselves, meaning rather than having their own farm, their own business, their own craft shop or something like that, they are working for somebody else, and that somebody else is paying them a regular wage. That's 2/3 of American workers, and that's by 1890. So people are changing how they identify as laborers, right? They're not in the business for themselves. They're in it for somebody else. They're working for somebody else, producing for somebody else. Things are changing so dramatically that by 1913, the United States is producing 1/3 of the world's industrial output, which is more than Great Britain, France, and Germany combined. A lot of that is credit to the fact that these industries, I should say, are not just concentrated in one spot like they had been during the First Industrial Revolution. It's not just in New England and not just in the Northeast. These industries are now spreading from the Northeast into the Midwest. So you now have cities that are thriving because of industries. These cities are places like Pittsburgh, Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City. These are cities in the Midwest who are now benefiting from new industries. So it's not just old industries producing old things. These are new industries that are being created. These industries are going to be things like producing processed foods, new chemicals, new kinds of weapons. Put a star by that or an asterisk by that, because that's going to be important later on in a couple of lectures. Hint, hint, clue, clue. Which is why the second industrial revolution is such a big deal. So new kinds of weaponry, including chemical weapons. So that's why weapons are a big deal. All sorts of new technologies and industries are created. And because of that, there are 11 million Americans who, over the course of the 50 years, 1870 to 1920, 11 million Americans will move from rural areas to cities, because cities are where the jobs are. So rather than living in rural Illinois, they're moving to Chicago. Chicago is where the jobs are. And in addition to those 11 million Americans living and working in the city, you have an additional 25 million immigrants arriving in the United States for job opportunities. Again, this points to the gilded part of the Gilded Age, right? That industry is booming and technologies are advancing, so much so that there are jobs available everywhere. Americans are moving to the cities. Lifestyles are changing. Immigrants see this as a place of opportunity. So immigrants are flooding into the country, right? And it's completely changing how they live. The other thing that completely changes how people live is the railroad. Railroads are remarkable in how they impact American society. If I had the option and the opportunity, I would absolutely 1000% teach a class entirely on the railroads. That's how significant railroads are. When we talk about the impact of the railroad, I showed you the photograph of the Transcontinental Railroad. Listen, the Transcontinental Railroad literally physically united the country, but the railroads in general, especially those that start to go out west, are uniting the nation, not just in a physical sense. They're doing so on a lot of levels. They are, because of these railroads, they are creating a truly national market. What I mean by a national market, it means that a company somewhere in Connecticut could now sell their products to someone living in Wyoming, or someone living in Washington or Oregon, right? That means that living on the opposite coast from somebody else doesn't mean that you are completely separated from them at all times. You can still communicate with them because railroads allow for easier ways for the postal service to deliver mail. It improves other means of communication as well. It significantly improves travel. So people are able to travel easily. By the 1890s, there are 5 transcontinental lines, 5 of them. And these transcontinental lines would transport products for mining companies, ranching companies, foresting companies, all sorts of goods and products to the American West. And that's incredibly important because the American West, by the 1880s and 1890s, has an increasingly growing population. More and more people are showing up in the American West, and they need more stuff. And railroads make it possible. When we talk about railroads, you automatically have to think of innovation. Innovation is this ability, right, to create, to think about the possibilities, right? You want to be able to, when you think about people who are innovative are people who can think of or create new methods to work, new ways to travel, new ways to entertain, and the big names that we associate with the Gilded Age in innovation are Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. These two men lead the way in innovation during this time period, and they are incredibly competitive with each other. Now, granted, Tesla is responsible for a lot of his own creations, whereas Edison does a lot of relying on his own on other people to help him out. That yet and still, I think what makes Edison more successful than Tesla is that Edison is an inventor, but he's also a businessman who is ruthless, and so he knows how to sell his products. He knows how to capitalize on opportunity better than Nikola Tesla. Tesla is responsible for things like creating the first radio, which is going to revolutionize how people entertain themselves at home, how people communicate. He is responsible for what would become remote controls, eventually what would become X-rays. He is responsible for contributing ideas to computers, radars. He's the guy who first envisions the understanding for 3D objects. Edison is responsible for the light bulb, the phonograph, the moving picture, which will eventually become the film, and film industry, which is another way that Americans would find entertainment. He is going to be responsible for figuring out how electricity can be created and brought to homes, right? So, both of them compete for this. These guys revolutionize and change how people live, work, entertain. For example, because of the light bulb, people could now work at night, which not everybody's thrilled about, but company owners are absolutely thrilled about. So there's a lot of creativity in this moment. Immigration is also incredibly important here too, because as I mentioned, when we talk about 25 million people are going to change the aspect or the outgrowth, the identity of the country. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture about who these people are, where they're coming from, and why they matter. But we know that they're coming in for the jobs, and they're coming in by the millions. Now, because of how successful things are, how economically prosperous things are going, there is a tendency for business owners in particular to become quite competitive and force each other to either go out of business or do ruthless things, right? So this is where you start to see the establishment, and I don't know if I have it on here. The establishment of trusts. Trusts are legal devices where rival companies would be managed by a single director. So say, for example, you and 3 other people all run a paper company. And each of you, there's 4 paper companies here. All of you are competing in the same market, like the eastern coast of the United States. All of you are competing for paper sales, and the competition is ruining each other's business. So the government says to you, okay, either you have to price things fairly, or, you've got to figure things out in a different way. Somebody's got to move. Somebody's got to do something. Essentially what these company owners are saying is, hey, we'll just establish a trust. The trust is a device that we're using to hold ourselves accountable. So you, company owner, you ask me to oversee each of these companies. So I'm going to be the one to make sure that each of your paper companies are doing things fairly. You are not scheming and scamming against each other. But here's the problem. Let's say I'm closer to one of you than I am to the other 3. I will do whatever I can to benefit the one over the other three. And so the problem with this solution, this alleged solution, is that it's short-lived, right? There's no way that this sort of accountability is going to work. And in fact, what ends up happening more often than not is one of those companies is going to end up eating up the other companies, and it'll just become one gigantic conglomerate, where one company gets all of the profits over the others, and they end up cornering the market, right? This is going to result in the establishment of, or the creation of, robber barons. Robber barons were industrial leaders who, depending on who you talk to, there are some people who would describe robber barons as industrial leaders, or captains of industry is the phrase that they like to use, because they were so successful and made so much money. And so a lot of people see them as, oh, these are guys who fulfilled the American dream. They climbed up the corporate ladder, the economic ladder, and look at what they've accomplished. We should strive to be them. Okay, so that's one way to see it. But robber barons, the title of robber barons is essentially people who see these guys as ruthless businessmen who found ways to sort of cheat their way to the top and scammed and schemed their way to the top. And they used tools to essentially guarantee their wealth. There are a couple of tools that I want to mention here that they use to guarantee their wealth. The first one is vertical integration. Vertical integration is when a company controls every phase of business, from finding the raw materials to the distribution of the final product and every phase in between. So literally, if you can imagine it in your mind's eye, from the ground up, vertical, from the ground up, this company controls every phase of the business. So the perfect example of someone who uses vertical integration is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie ran a company called U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel was based out of Pittsburgh, which is why Pittsburgh's football team is the Pittsburgh Steelers. So U.S. Steel is established in the 1870s, and immediately Carnegie employs vertical integration. So this means that finding the raw material, using hydroelectric energy to create steel, creating ways to process this steel, transporting the steel to other companies, the manufacturing of the steel, distributing the steel, promoting the steel, selling it to other companies, connecting to other people across the country. Every phase of that process is controlled by, run by Andrew Carnegie. So in other words, he's not paying a middleman. He's not paying another company to handle PR or advertising. He's not paying another company to drill. He's not paying another company to manufacture. Everything goes through his company. That's vertical integration, from the ground up, from producing things, taking things out of the ground until they are sent out to the public. That's vertical integration. The second tool to guarantee wealth is horizontal expansion. So think of, you are going across, like the horizon, going across horizontally, right? This is when you buy out your competitors to control the market as much as possible. So if you and your competition are standing in a line, this would make sense. So let's say you're still in the paper industry, and there are you and the three others, right? The four of you are standing right next to each other because you're all competing against each other, as if you're in a race, okay? Horizontal expansion essentially says you would buy out the other three, take control of their companies, And that is horizontal expansion. You are expanding your company out horizontally. So that way, you are cornering the market and you are taking in as many profits as possible from that one industry. One great example of this is John Rockefeller. The Rockefeller family to this day still exists. John D. Rockefeller is the guy who exemplifies this the best. In the 1880s, he establishes Standard Oil, actually long before that, so don't say 1880s. So I think it's late 1860s, early 1870s. In the 1870s, here's Standard Oil. Standard Oil is an oil company, obviously, and it starts out on the East Coast. What starts to happen is he starts pushing other oil companies out of business through competition. He arranges secret deals with railroad companies so that railroad companies don't purchase oil or don't agree to distribute other companies' oil, only distribute his company's oil. He finds ways to fix prices so that other oil companies don't actually make any profit. So he is ruthless. So by the 1880s, within about 10 years of the company existing, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the oil industry, which is huge. 90% of the oil industry. So 90% of the oil profits in this country went to John D. Rockefeller's pocket. And here's the other thing about Rockefeller. Rockefeller, once he exercised horizontal expansion, he also exercised vertical integration. So he would buy out those companies and then he would buy out or he would control the production process. So drilling for oil, that would be his company. Refining the oil, that would be his company. Distributing the oil, that's his company too. Everything from drilling to distribution would be his company. So he's making profits off of that. Now, he gave most of his wealth away. He established a bunch of foundations to promote education and medical research. So he's got this philanthropist reputation because he saw himself and he feared that people would see him as, a robber baron, because he kind of was one, mumble, mumble. But at the same time, when workers tried to unionize for better wages and working conditions, safer working conditions at that, he immediately fought against them. Carnegie is the same way. Carnegie gives away a huge amount of money. There are Carnegie libraries across the country, including one on OU's campus. The Carnegie donates to a bunch of art institutes. But he also fights back against workers who are trying to fight for better working conditions. And that's what leads me into this important point. When we talk about freedom, because we've talked about the idea of freedom and Reconstruction, freedom in the Gilded Age is challenge because the Second Industrial Revolution creates a bit of an identity crisis for this country. The Second Industrial Revolution will introduce terms like better classes, the respectable classes. And of course, that is applied to those people who are wealthy. People like John D. Rockefeller, people like Carnegie. These are people who are captains of industry, right? Whereas people who were working class, people who were working along the factory lines, or people who were working for Carnegie were seen as, quote unquote, the dangerous class. There is a bitterness that often develops between employees and employers. And anyone who, if you're an employee, if there was ever any talk about joining a union or creating a union. And remember, unions are supposed to be workers' organizations that are designed to advocate for workers. Any talk about a union, and immediately these workers would be described as troublemakers. Unions were often labeled as foreign, which is essentially them saying that you are un-American and at times anti-American, right? Meanwhile, management would be presented as job creators, captains of industry, money makers, and the ultimate example of the success of capitalism, right? And that leads me to this mindset that has taken place in the Gilded Age of social Darwinism. If you think about what Darwinism is, when you learned about it in biology, Darwinism is a reference to, of course, the concept of evolution, that evolution is a natural process that just takes place and there's no interference. So when evolution takes place, it's this mentality of only the strongest survive, right? It's people, animals, plants, whatever, who adjust to their environment for the sake of survival. And if you don't make those adjustments, then you die. That's evolution, right? Social Darwinism is a lot like that. It takes after this biological concept, except it's a lot more, meaner, right? It's less empathetic. There's no sense of empathy, kindness, no thought to humanity. Social Darwinism essentially says that if a person is poor and if a person is living in destitute conditions, then that's that person's fault. You are responsible for your luck. So if you've had bad luck, that's your fault. That's on you. You didn't adapt. You didn't evolve. You didn't get better. And on the other hand, guys like Andrew Carnegie adapted and evolved. And that's why he's doing better. That's why he's wealthy. That's why he succeeded. And because of that, this whole idea of social Darwinism basically says we shouldn't interrupt that. This is just a natural process. And because of that, wealthy people should not be punished for being wealthy, and poor people are just poor. And we shouldn't have to go out of our way to help poor people because they chose not to help themselves. That's what social Darwinism tells you. It doesn't take into consideration the humanity, the economics of the situation. It's essentially taking a natural concept, a biological concept, and making it social and economical. That if you're poor, that's on you. You're just going to have to live with your poverty. And you're stuck with your poverty. And there's no way to get out of it unless you figure out how to adapt and move on. This is going to translate, this kind of mentality is going to translate into the larger system, specifically into the legal system, into this concept of liberty of contract. So liberty of contract is a judicial concept that specifically addresses labor unions. So, and not just labor unions, workers in general. So when there are workers who try to protest for or strike for better working conditions, many times, if this was available, they would cite laws that suggested, or laws that essentially established standards for working conditions, standards for safe working conditions. Liberty of contract basically says that those laws were actually violations of economic freedom, that an employer was actually being inhibited or limited from making as much money as they can because of these laws that are telling them how to run their business. And so when we're putting laws on, worker safety and working conditions, what we're actually doing is we're holding back capitalism, we're holding back profitability. That's illegal. We have to undo all of that. Essentially, what they're saying, what this judicial concept is saying is industrialists, people who own these companies and these factories, these industries, should be able to make the profit that they want to make or that they can make, regardless of the conditions in which their workers are working, right? So if their workers are in trouble or they're struggling, then it is what it is. Sacrifices have to be made. And this is really important because during the Gilded Age of the industrialized nations, the United States has the highest death rate among its workers of all the industrialized nations. So we're talking about Great Britain, France, Germany, of all of these industrialized nations and other nations. They're not the only ones, but these are the ones that I'm thinking of on the top of my head. But of all the industrialized nations in the world, the United States leads the way in worker deaths, but also worker injuries. And keep in mind, when I say workers, I'm not just talking about grown adults. There are children as young as the age of 6 who are working in mines. And they're working in mines because sometimes the caves are, when they go into the earth, which is the only way I can describe this, the caverns are so small that only a child can fit through. And that's why they hire children. So there are children involved, women involved, men involved, and there are people who are dying. Either they die on the job or they die from diseases caught on the job. They lose limbs because of the job. It's problematic, to say the least, right? But there is a lot of questions about this, right? When you think about the validity of the liberty of contract, like how is this possible? Remember what the mindset is of this time period. So yeah, equal protection under the law is great because that's what the 14th Amendment says. But when people are only thinking about profitability and they get rid of this idea of humanity and they start seeing people as, tools in a machine rather than individuals who have families or people who have their own needs and should be, provided for, paid for, or whatever, it becomes an entirely different conversation, right? In these two slides, you'll notice both of these slides. Let me see if I can go back here. We've had two very similar situations, right? There has been one central character who's been getting money into his pockets, like this guy here. On the one hand, from legitimate business, the guy on the left is giving him money from legitimate business. And on the other hand, he is getting the benefits of tariffs, taxes on companies from other countries. And the corporation is getting the benefits of those. In this particular cartoon, when you see this man, he is paying other people, but who he is paying are basically politicians who will do his bidding as long as he continues to pay them. That's how these businessmen, these industrialists get to continue ruthlessly doing their business, conducting their business, and doing so through loopholes. And in the meantime, you'll notice at the bottom of this picture is the man who is being crushed under all of this guy's power, right? He is using a railroad monopoly, essentially somebody who has cornered the railroad market, to crush this guy who represents the taxpayer. And you'll notice that the taxpayer is tied to the railroad tracks. So there's no way that he can save himself, right? This is sort of typical, this idea that the regular person, the regular American, really doesn't have a say here. And so the question is, why not? Why isn't anything being done about this? If this is such a pervasive problem, if this is happening everywhere, why aren't we doing something about it? Well, first and foremost, you have to acknowledge that there's a problem. And there are plenty of people who don't think that there's a problem in the first place, right? If they don't think that there's a problem, then there's not going to be any effort to fix it, right? There's that. Then there's a tremendous amount of corruption, as the previous cartoon demonstrated. People who are wealthy have access to politicians, access to political influence, which helps them gain access to loopholes where they are making money to do whatever they want. But on top of that, in larger cities especially, you have political bosses. And political bosses essentially run the politics of their cities. New York is notorious for having political bosses, but so are places like Chicago, St. Louis, or not St. Louis, but Kansas City has political bosses. Anywhere where there is a large city population, chances are you're going to have a political boss. It's someone who runs the politics of the area. And essentially, a person isn't elected to office unless that political boss has given their okay, right? And this is something that you need to keep in mind. During the Gilded Age, there is no such thing as a secret ballot. So people are not only going to know that you voted, they're going to know how you voted. And voting is very high at this time. There's usually high turnouts in elections, not just presidential elections, but every election. But they watch how you vote. So a political boss will send out his goons, and this happens a lot, especially in New York, where they watch you and how you vote. And they do so after threatening you that if you don't vote a certain way or for a certain candidate, they can threaten your job. They can threaten your access to healthcare, your child's access to healthcare. Those are all very real threats. That's how much power a political boss has. And then on top of that, if a politician doesn't side with a political boss in a certain way, then that politician can easily lose that seat. They lose that congressional seat. They lose that mayoral office. That's a real problem. It's extensive corruption. Here's the other problem. One historian calls it the politics of dead center. What that means is people are at a stalemate. In other words, they are okay with not siding with one extreme or the other. Everybody's in the middle. And here's the thing. The problem with everybody being in the middle is that nobody is pushing them to think about issues differently. So, for example, for every Bernie Sanders, right, you need a Donald Trump. You need one person on the left and one person on the right, because what those two voices do is help you to see what those two sides are talking about and create two real debates, right? And whether or not you lean left or lean right, that's not the point here. What was happening during the Gilded Age is nobody's leaning any which way. So nobody's demanding anything. Nobody's making a push for anything. Nobody's making a push for accountability. Nobody's making a push for a reduction in corruption. Nobody is looking out for regular workers. So you start to see this corruption at all levels of government. This is a great example. So this is a political cartoon that depicts what was happening in the U.S. Senate, and you'll notice that the title of this is here at the bottom, and that it's called "The Bosses of the Senate." But there are a couple of things that I want you to pay attention to. One is looking at the two entrances into this room. There is this entrance here, and then there is this entrance here, right? Compare the two sizes of the doors, right? The one that I've circled, that's the people's entrance, and you'll notice that's a regular size door. Whereas this one is gigantic, right? It's massive. And that's because this entrance is for monopolists. And so you'll notice that the monopolists are not normal sized people, right? They are giants with their giant bellies and their giant heads and their giant hats. But you'll notice on their bellies, you can see what monopoly they represent. So this is copper. This other guy was the steel beam. Here's Standard Oil, which we talked about. Here's iron. There's the sugar trust. Sugar was a real problem in the 1880s and 1890s. Here's coal, which is a real problem. So all of these industries are huge. And it's important that you notice that on their bellies, there's the dollar sign. So their size is tied to their wealth. That's why they're so big. It's not because they're physically gigantic, right? We're not talking about, actually gigantic people. We are talking about people whose wealth, monopolies that are so wealthy, they are, metaphorically gigantic. Now, in this same situation, let me go back and circle this entrance. You'll notice for the people's entrance, not only is it normal sized, it's also closed, right? That's the thing. So in the balcony where the people are supposed to be sitting, this is the thing. People are supposed to be able to sit here and watch what happens. There is nobody there. Whereas right here, right behind the senators, so here are the senators seated here, right? These are all senators. Literally right behind them, you can see these gigantic monopolists. Okay? So it's an indication of how influential these monopolists are. Now, I want you to notice the sign that indicates the motto for the Senate, right? It says, if you can't see it, this is a Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, and for the monopolists. It's taking a Lincoln quote and changing it to the time period, because what he says in his speech at Gettysburg is that this nation is of the people, by the people, for the people. And here the cartoonist is talking about the Senate being of the monopolists, by the monopolists, for the monopolists. This next cartoon is similar in its messaging, except it's directly about the impact of these monopolists on workers, right? There are a couple of things that I want you to notice. You can actually divide this cartoon into two halves if you look at, a couple of different ways, right? So if you look at this left and right and you split it kind of down the middle, you'll notice that on this side, it's much darker. And on this side, there's a whole lot of light, right? It's a lot brighter. And that is supposed to indicate the mood. So on this side, it's darker because people are sadder. It's more depressing. But if you were to also split it across this way, you'll notice that it's also darker on the bottom and lighter on top. That's important for you to pay attention to. Now, keeping along those lines, pay attention to who these people are. Similar to the previous cartoon, these are guys with dollar signs on their bellies. So they're not actually look like this. The faces are similar. So this face accurate. But their bellies indicate how wealthy they are. This is W.C. Fields. This is Jay Gould. This is Vanderbilt. These guys have made millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. Okay. And underneath them, you'll notice that they have all of these workers holding these guys up and keeping them from getting into the water. Now, one of the things that I want you to notice here is that the cartoonist is including how much these workers are paid. Iron workers are paid $7 a week, linen workers $11 a week, leather workers $7 a week, paper workers $6 a week, and it's pretty safe to assume that there are workers all the way around, and you'll notice that they are hunched over and carrying this literally on their backs, right? So that these four guys, with all of their wealth, can stay out of the water. And the water is not just water. He labels the water as hard times. So these guys, these workers are almost knee deep in hard times, making sure that these guys don't feel it. And the cartoonist has labeled this or entitled this cartoon, The Protectors of Our Industries. And what he's trying to do is have you question who really is the protector of our industry. Because what social Darwinists will tell you is that these guys are the protectors of our industries because they are captains of industry. These are the guys who are money makers. They're the guys who are employers. But what the cartoonist is saying is that these guys who are keeping these guys afloat and making these guys all that money, those guys are the protectors of industry. I'm telling you guys, political cartoons are great tools as primary sources. Okay. So with all of that in mind and these ideas of labor and that sort of thing, despite the fact that they are working against a very difficult mentality, there are people who try to push back against this idea that the employers can do no wrong, right? One of those groups is the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor is one of the largest unions in the country. And the Knights of Labor come up with this concept that is essentially their motivating factor here. They call it conditions essential to liberty. One of the things that you should know about the Knights of Liberty is that this is an all-inclusive union. It's workers across multiple industries. So it's not just coal workers or paper workers. It's papers across all industries. The only people they excluded were Chinese workers because #racism. So the Knights of Labor, at its peak in 1886, they had nearly 800,000 members. So they are by far the largest union in the country. They organized millions of strikes, millions of people in strikes and boycotts and different forms of political action. So they come up with this, concentrated strategic attack against social Darwinism, because social Darwinism, they argue, is destroying this American concept of democracy and the American concept of freedom and equality, which is why they turn to the Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson and the four other guys who, contributed to the Declaration, they write, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain and unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So what the Knights of Labor do is they take the Declaration of Independence, specifically that phrase, and they say that workers have been denied their unalienable rights because there has been an unjust domination by a special class. And what they're talking about is the wealthy. These wealthy people, these so-called successful classes, right? These so-called captains of industry have unjustly demeaned and abused working class people. And the problem with that is that it has not only denied these unalienable rights, but that unalienable right includes this concept of having a life that includes liberty, right? That when we talk about this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's not just a concept. You have to be able to afford it. You have to be able to physically enjoy it. If you are in unsafe or dangerous working conditions, if you are paid $7 a week, then you do not have the means to enjoy a life where you can pursue happiness. You do not have the means to enjoy a life at all, let alone a life with liberty. When they're talking about the conditions essential to liberty, what they're talking about is the economic means to freedom, which is what we talked about in Reconstruction. When we talked about freed people's definitions of freedom in their economic perspective, they said, listen, we believe that freedom doesn't just limit itself to social stuff and political stuff. It also includes economic stuff. That's what the Knights of Labor are arguing. If somebody wants to be free, if somebody wants to have access to liberty, there are conditions that have to be met. And that means that they have to be paid a fair wage. They have to be working in safe conditions and not risking their lives and their limbs just for a job, right? This sort of mentality is going to spread among workers where it motivates them to take action. And so strikes are going to be really prevalent in the 1880s and 1890s. The one that I want to talk about for our benefit is the Haymarket Affair, which takes place in Chicago. Chicago in the 1880s has a very large, really vibrant labor movement. It's made up of immigrants. It's made up of Americans. All of them are working class, obviously. And in 1885, there are a bunch of iron workers. So these are skilled industrial workers who decide that they were going to organize a strike because their company, their factory, had decided on a wage reduction. And so, of course, the workers are like, what do you mean a wage reduction? We are skilled workers. We deserve the wage that we get. How are you? If anything, we deserve a pay raise. And instead, these guys are bringing in a wage reduction. So the company, when the strike is called, the company brings in a police force that they hire. So a private police force to literally fight against these strikers. Okay. So it becomes violent, and the mayor of Chicago and even other businessmen go to the company and they say, hey, listen, this is becoming ruckus. Please compromise. So in February of 1886, the company decides, okay, here's our compromise. They install new machinery so that they don't need as many people working the line. In other words, they start laying off workers and they have machines to replace the workers. And any workers that are hired to do the remaining jobs have to be hired on a non-union basis. You have to promise essentially that you won't join the union. So instead of compromising and bringing the strike to a conclusion, they're essentially prolonging the strike. Okay. when these workers are like, what the heck? You saw how violent this got. You saw how unhappy we are. You know that we can do good work. Why would you make this worse? They are pleading with the city leaders. Can you please do something for us? Can you advocate for us? And instead, the city government sides with the company owners, and they send in the police, the actual city police. So on May 3rd, 1886, 4 strikers were killed by police officers because the strikers were trying to prevent strike breakers. In other words, people who were hired to work while the strike was going on. Present day, we call them scabs. So strike breakers, these guys were being prevented from coming into the factory. 4 strikers were killed by the police on the very next day, on May 4th, in protest to the death of those 4 people. There is a mass meeting at Haymarket Square. That's the flyer that you see there in front of you. The top half of it is obviously in English. The bottom half of it is in Polish because there is a huge Polish population in Chicago. And most of the workers there are Polish. So there is a mass meeting that's organized at Haymarket Square. And this is to protest the killings of those 4 people. At the end of the speeches, somebody, to this day, nobody knows who, somebody threw a bomb into the crowd. The bomb actually kills a policeman. And so police actually opened fire as a means of controlling the crowd and also, attacking or trying to attack the person or people who threw the bomb. Several bystanders were shot, but so were other police officers. So the police officers were obviously hit by friendly fire. On that same night, what the police officers decide to do is they decided to raid the offices of the labor unions, of groups that they thought were radical, and they arrested all of their leaders. And so the idea was, if we can arrest their leaders, if we can take all of their information, this is how we can stop the movement. The legacy of Haymarket is that, labor is dangerous. It's anti-American. They kill police officers. They are prone to violence. These are a bunch of foreigners who are radicals, and they are trying to create chaos and anarchy. And in fact, after this whole matter is sort of settled, 8 anarchists were charged with plotting and carrying out the bombing. But again, to this day, nobody knows who actually threw the bomb. The 8 anarchists, 5 of them were German. 1 was an English immigrant. 1 American who was arrested was of German descent. I'm sorry, was that German? My apologies. So the photograph or the image that you see on the right is actually the image that was published in newspapers across the country. It was a depiction of what took place at Haymarket Square, the bottom, but the top are the 7 officers who end up dying that night. Most of them, if not all of them, from the gunshot wounds. So they died of friendly fire, but that's not the story that Americans are told. The story is, this is what unions do. Unions cause chaos. Unions are anti-American. Unions are radical. And that message is going to continue on for decades because that's the message that works to the benefit of employers. Now, while all of this is happening in the Midwest and even on the East Coast, there is a lot that's happening in the western half of the United States. And that's the transformation of the American West. One of the things that I do want to address first and foremost, though, is the myth of the American West, starting with the American cowboy, and really just focusing on the American cowboy. So the American cowboy during the Gilded Age, starting in the Gilded Age and even to present day, the American cowboy is seen as this symbol of American freedom and even masculinity. He is the epitome of toughness, somebody who can endure the most rugged terrain. It's just him and his horse. He can fight and he can rustle cattle and he can survive out in nature. He's the man's man, yada, yada. And he's out in the West because the West represents possibilities, opportunities, and it's all of these things that seek out this time and this place of civilization, right? You'll notice the painting on the right. The painting on the right is actually some artists' rendition of what they believe to be happening in the West. And I love using this picture because of how they believed or what they believed to be happening. First of all, I want to point you to the central figure here because you can't avoid her. This central figure is important because all the light in this painting is behind her, right? And the darkness, of course, is all in front of her. And so the message is that she's the one bringing the light. What you have to understand about her is that she is representative of a divine messenger, right? She is a messenger of God. And you'll notice that around her, you have a cowboy, you have a wagon, you also have guys who are supposed to represent farmers and miners. You have another wagon, but this is supposed to represent a family. You have a couple of railroads. So that's more families, more businesses. Here's another farmer. All of them are around her light, right? So they're following her lead and they're all going out west. And you'll also notice something important here too, that with her, she is carrying this cable. This is for the telegram, which is a brand new communicative innovation of the Gilded Age, where people can now communicate with each other much quicker, almost instantaneously. And so she's bringing that with her too. And you'll notice that here, as they are conquering the West, there are things that are running away, right? So things and people that are running away. So here are a group of buffalo. Here are indigenous people running away from obviously what the painter believes to be civilization. And here is a bear and a wolf and other animals. So the idea is that these are all items that are supposed to represent civilization, and the cowboy is supposed to represent masculinity. The problem, though, is that that's not actually what happens. Cowboys live a miserable, terrible, horrible life. When ranching companies advertise for cowboys, the advertisements include conditions of single orphans preferred. In other words, they would rather have men who had no family ties whatsoever, because being a cowboy meant you are literally putting your life on the line, and you are putting your life on the line for cattle. Your job as a cowboy was to be in charge of cattle runs. The longest cattle run in the American West, and arguably in the United States, went from Texas all the way up to Montana. There are a few cattle runs that actually go through Oklahoma as well, but the longest is from Texas to Montana. And your job as a cowboy would be to make sure that every single head of cattle made it all the way up to the train, to the railroad tracks in Montana. That means you have to protect cattle from bears, from wolves, from any predator, and from any natural disaster that takes place along the way. So if there is a riverbank that you have to cross, then you've got to make sure that each cow makes it across safely and without hurting themselves. Okay? If that means that you have to get in between a bear and the cattle, then that's what you're going to do. If that means you have to sacrifice your life so that a cow makes it across the river and you drown, that's what you've got to do. That's the life of a cowboy. It is a terrible, terrible job. And here's the thing. They prefer orphans who have no family ties, because what happens to cowboys is those cowboys who die along the way are just buried out wherever in the West, and the cattle train continues. I mean, that's the situation. There is no memorial service. There is no great sort of, recollection given. No, nothing. No marker that's created. They are buried in the West wherever they die, and that's it. The job continues. It is a terrible, terrible job. But that's what's allowed for and permitted for because of Western industries. One of the things that you should know about these cowboys is cowboys were white men, black men, and Mexican men. The cowboys were multiracial, and these cattle drives would go for all of these hundreds of miles in the names of these cattle companies, ranching companies, because these companies would make millions of dollars and do extremely well. This cattle would be shipped off to markets across the country thanks to railroads, right? When we talk about these Western industries, these Western industries are really the heart and soul of really settling the American West. People have often talked about things like the gold rush of California, or maybe the silver rush in Colorado, gold rush in Alaska, and talk about how a lot of people will move to the West because of their desire to find gold. But the real mineral wealth of the West is in oil and salt and lumber and coal. That's what brings the real wealth, because that wealth is sustainable. Gold, once you find a brick of gold, that's it. That's your wealth. But there are coal mines. There are oil wells, right? Lumber is from a forest. So these are sustainable sources of income. And so larger industries make this sustainable income from these types of resources. But in order to succeed in the West, they had to get one major obstacle out of the way. That obstacle would be the Plains Indians tribes. The Plains Indians tribes were the dominant force of the plains. So when I talk about the American plains, I'm talking about North Dakota all the way down to Texas. We're talking about states like Colorado and Idaho, all the way through like parts of Minnesota. So the entire plains area is dominated, as you can see in the painting, dominated by the buffalo. And buffalo are central to Plains Indians culture. One of the things that you need to know is that Plains Indians culture, Plains Indians tribes were hunting tribes. They are hunting tribes. They created their culture to center themselves around the buffalo, in that every part of the buffalo, once it's hunted and killed, every part of the buffalo is used for something. And in fact, I can show you this. Let me go ahead for a second. So this is an indication of why the buffalo matters so much to Plains Indians tribes. Everything from the skull to its dung is used for something, right? So its hide is used for clothing, for moccasins, for cradles. The brains are used to help prepare the hide. The hooves are used for glue and rattles. I want you to pay attention to this very important fact right here. I'm going to highlight this because this is going to be significant in a couple of minutes. The buffalo skull is used as an altar at their religious ceremonies. So this is not just about practical use, it's also about cultural and religious use. The way that, oh, hang on, I'm sorry. The way that boys trained to become soldiers or warriors, not soldiers, but warriors in Plains tribes culture is by learning how to hunt. As they became hunters, that's how they became warriors. And warrior culture is what helped give them a sense of identity in their tribe. So when we talk about the buffalo are everything. But here's the problem with the buffalo. The buffalo get in the way of railroads. When the railroads try to go out west, when you have massive herds of literally hundreds of buffalo, railroad construction can't take place because the buffalo are in the way, and the buffalo really don't care about westward expansion, as you can imagine. And the Plains Indians tribes also get in the way because they're conducting their hunts. So as westward expansion starts to take place, here are Plains Indians tribes trying to live their normal, regular, everyday lives. And Americans see that as obstacles in the way of westward progress. And Plains Indians tribes see the American expansion as imposition onto their way of life, right? So railroad companies call on the American government and say, hey, you've got to do something because the buffalo are in the way and these Plains Indians people are hunting the buffalo and they're getting in the way too. So the government calls on and hires buffalo hunters to kill as many buffalo as possible. So over the course of 4 years, from 1870 to 1874, over 4 million buffalo are killed. Over 4 million buffalo are killed. Buffalo are killed nearly to the point of extinction. And this is almost the crowning point of 2 decades of fighting in this region. What I mean by this is from the 1850s into the 1870s, this region had been so contentious over westward expansion. There has been so much fighting and so many challenges on where Americans would settle and the fact that they were trying to settle on lands that had belonged to different Plains Indians tribes. And there's a lot more to this that I won't go into detail into now. If you take American Indians or History of Oklahoma, I can go into that and explain it better. But just know that over the course of 20-something years, there is battle after battle after battle. There are massacres that take place. There are soldiers that will literally target toddlers in a means of sending a message to tribal members. And so when these buffalo hunts take place, it's this ultimate sign of the dehumanization and disrespect of Plains Indians tribes. The message being, get out of the way, westward expansion is taking place. It culminates in 1887 with the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act essentially breaks up Indian lands. So Indians, the Plains Indian tribes had by this point been removed to lands that had been separated for them. Those were called reservations. And when the government realizes that these tribes were living communally still, and not on individual plots of land, the Dawes Act splits up the reservations into individual plots of land. And when they realize, oh, there's there's a lot of extra land here that's not being occupied by these tribes members, we'll just take that extra land back. So they take what they call, the federal government takes what it calls surplus lands away from Native peoples in this area. So after 20 years of fighting, what ends up happening is Plains Indians tribes really sort of end up losing the heart and soul of their cultural and tribal identity. And this is what one of the examples of what buffalo hunters end up doing to the buffalo. The government tells these buffalo hunters, listen, you can do whatever you want to the buffalo. We don't care, just as long as you kill the buffalo. So buffalo hunters will do things like this. You'll notice there's a man up at the top and the man at the bottom, and they are standing on what looks like thousands and thousands of buffalo skulls. And I'd like to remind you of what that previous image showed us, that the buffalo skull was an altar for religious ceremonies. And you'll notice that these men have their feet resting on the buffalo skulls. Imagine somebody taking a symbol that represented your faith, your religion, or something that was a part of your religious ceremony, and doing something like this. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about how this sort of is carried out to other groups of people across the country, working class people, Black Americans, Chinese immigrants, and so how this idea of the Gilded Age shows a very ugly side of the country. And we'll talk about attempts to fight back against that mentality as well. I'll see you in the next lecture.